It's ad break time. I am proud to announce that the Beyond Solitaire podcast is sponsored by Central Michigan University's Center for Learning Through Games and Simulations. On October 1st, they will be launching a new series called Art and System, which will be headed up by Tim Hutchings. The goal of the series is to showcase indie games and to push the boundaries of gaming. The first games to go to crowdfunding will be a revised edition of Liam Burke's Dog Eat Dog, Anna Anthropy's Princess with a Cursed Sword, and Timothy Kleinert's The Mountain Witch. This is a fantastic initiative that I am personally excited to support. Also, if you want to help me keep the lights on over here on the podcast, you can support me at patreon.com/beyondsolitaire. For now, though, let's get on with the show. Hey gamers, this is Liz Davis from Beyond Solitaire, and this week on the pod, I have a very special, only semi-gaming related episode. Here as my guest, I have Clifford Ando. He's a professor of classics and history at my alma mater, the University of Chicago. How are you doing today, Cliff?
Hey Liz, thank you for having me. I'm doing just great. It's a beautiful, beautiful day in Chicago.
Yeah, as we were discussing before, I watched your job talk when I was an undergrad before you've now had like a storied career at UChicago.
Yeah, I came to do that talk from a position at the University of Southern California, and I mention only because today is so spectacularly beautiful in Chicago. Many friends in Los Angeles gave me a hard time about moving to Chicago, not because they felt that the University of Southern California was actually a better employer or a better university. The claim they made was, if you had an opportunity to raise a child in Southern California and you took him away, in this case I say him because I had a son, that you were simply a bad parent, that it was just a better place to be a young person. And I have to say that both my son and I had a delightful time in Hyde Park. I'm a real fan of the South Side of Chicago.
Yeah, I miss it. I actually got ribbed about moving from Georgia to the Twin Cities about a year ago because it's like, oh, you ready for that first winter? I actually like it fine. It's been fine. But, our mutual love for UChicago has been perhaps a little challenged recently. I contacted you based on an email that you wrote that went around that was so incendiary. I honestly thought that I was being trolled, that somebody had made that up and said it came from you. But sadly, it was real. So what, for people who are not aware, what is at a baseline going on at the University of Chicago right now?
Oh, that's a great question, and I certainly hope it interests your listeners because it's a tale in a way specific to the University of Chicago, but the dynamics of what is happening here are playing out in many universities across the land. And I have to. A number of people wrote to me after the email was apparently posted by others on Twitter and Blue Sky and so on. A number of people wrote to me to say, "Is this really by you? If it is, I'm outraged." And I had to say, no, it was really by me. So the background is that the University of Chicago is in some financial difficulty. Many universities are currently in the loose space we might call some financial difficulty. In many cases, it has to do with overspending. In some cases, it has to do with something like specific forms of, local underfunding. That is to say, public universities are sometimes, in essence, deliberately underfunded by the state because the state doesn't want to pay so much, and so on and so forth. But as every one of your listeners will know, there has also been a series of constraints, attacks, however you wish to put the matter, on higher education by the Trump administration. This includes changes to the so-called endowment tax, the slashing of research funding that was already awarded, and in some cases, for the future year, they've requested from Congress much less money for research than people had requested in the past. So there's anxiety, and universities are having to respond through trimming their sails, through budget cuts. And that's the big background. And I'll just summarize the whole situation specifically by saying that, how are universities going to respond to budgetary problems whose origin, in very many cases, whose origin is specifically in science funding, because that's the area of the cuts in federal funding. There are other areas under pressure, but let us just say that. And the answer is that many universities are looking to make substantial changes, very substantial changes in the funding of money areas. It's initiated a process of rethinking and resource reallocation. And at Chicago specifically, they're making substantial changes in the division of humanities. And this includes, first of all, a proposal, not yet worked out, to quote unquote merge small departments into larger units, say to take an independent entity like South Asian languages and merge it into some big agglomeration like world languages. They charged a committee to study the question whether some languages should even be offered. And they put a quote unquote pause for at least a year in admissions of doctoral students, specifically in departments whose curriculum is organized around foreign languages. To put it that way, another way to put that is to say they simply paused doctoral education in almost every subject area that studies the world other than North America. And that was a formulation like that was what made my description of what was happening so incendiary. But I stand by it, that that there was a retreat to essentially modernity and Northern America in the ambitions of the University of Chicago.
I find it really important to note here that, especially for the character of UChicago as a university, this is stunning in a bad way. So my own undergraduate life was a blessed life because I got to do Latin, I got to do Greek, I got to get my German for reading out of the way. It was great. But I also took Coptic as an undergrad, and I got to take a semester, a quarter, to a couple quarters of Demotic, which is, for those of y'all who don't know, the Egyptian language starts with hieroglyphs, but it doesn't end there. It goes through several stages. And so I was basically getting to do late stage Egyptian language study as an undergrad. And I had friends who were taking things like Hittite.
Yeah. It'd be hard to overemphasize just in general what this means for the foreshortening of horizons of higher education in America in general. But there's a specific problem at Chicago, which you've put your finger on, which is that Chicago had this remarkable specialization in the study of the languages of, let us say, broadly speaking, the ancient Mediterranean world and the ancient Near East. And that's a thing in itself. It's extraordinarily important that a place with this kind of exercise continue to practice it, because if you allow a field like this to die, if you interrupt continuity, it's not entirely clear it will be or could be resurrected in the same way. You might simply be ending it. But the other thing is, right, in the kind of internal anguish that many of these humanistic fields have felt in recent years, in one way or the other. Classics has been wrestling with the question, is classics an inherently elitist field? Is there something troubling about the high barriers of entry? And more specifically, you might say there's been an interesting wrestling with the fact that, are we in fact an area studies department? We're often put in a bundle with South Asian studies, East Asian studies, Middle Eastern studies, but classics is not, it's not an area study. I mean, the Greeks and the Romans lived in the Mediterranean, but we do not make any attempt to include, that's right, Rabbinic Hebrew, which was spoken in exactly the same geographic area, but somehow, because we're not an area study, they get pushed into a different place. We don't do Celtic, we don't do Oscan, we don't do Punic. So, and then the question becomes more pertinent to the people who do ancient history or ancient religion, or the ancient economy. the question becomes, in order to become a more capacious, better version of ourselves, should we actually embrace all the human beings who were living in the same space with the Greeks and the Romans? And there, I mentioned that obviously because Chicago, with its extraordinary skill in all of these ancient languages, Chicago was one of the places in the world best equipped by far to become a modern, better version of ancient history. So, I mean, people might think that studying all these dusty languages makes you look old-fashioned, but in a way, we were better equipped than anyone to be modern. And there's a real risk that in a very short-sighted, hasty decision, we might give up that talent. We might give up that that ability to be cutting edge, and that would be a terrible shame.
Yeah, I think a lot of these conversations about the humanities and universities are kind of couched in the idea of waste. Actually, I sent an email to Dean Nelson that I'm going to pull up because I thought it was very interesting. So I wrote to her expressing my concern about what I had seen. And she responded, "I don't know where that comes from. I'm sorry to be so blunt, but the rumors and rumor mongering are fraying my last nerve. We have always had robust language offerings, among the most in the country. We have to make some decisions about the full slate and cadence of some lesser taught languages where we have 1 or 2 students in a class." She did note that would not include anything in classics. So what's going on?
Right. I mean, to be perfectly honest, at some level, it's not actually entirely clear to me that the Dean of Humanities at the moment really understands the departments over which that she supervises, or understands how their curricula work.
Yeah.
Or for that matter, I mean, she's a professor of English. So in addition to the committee she charged with studying the question, should we merge certain departments? We can come back to the question of what merging might mean for the continuity of a field of study. She also set up a committee to study, to investigate the full panoply of language offerings at Chicago. And although this document began with some sentence of praise, language study is essential, it's a distinguishing feature of the University of Chicago, the specific questions posed to the committee was charged to answer the questions. 1, are there languages we can just cease offering? Are there languages we can offer every other year? Well, I mean, you mentioned how many different languages you have studied, right? If a beginning language is not being offered your first year at university, or say second year when you discover that the language even exists, right?
Yeah.
Your ability to follow it through to something like competence, your ability to acquire enough instruction to do meaningful study may be foreclosed. Sorry, are there languages we can stop offering? Are there languages we can offer every other year? Are there languages where we don't have to offer it, but we could have students take it at another university? I mean, did she mean take a bus to Loyola? Did she mean you could go back to your dorm room and sit on Zoom? Would we charge you the same tuition for taking the language at another university? And are there areas of language instruction that we could supplement with via AI? In essence, things we used to do with humans, could we actually just tell you to do it at home with AI? So the specific questions put, and just for your readers, let me just emphasize about something like the study of another culture. If you were to tell a math department you're not allowed to offer, you can be a math department, but you are not allowed to offer calculus or linear algebra. If you're not allowed to offer the basic stepping stones to competence, where's the math major? So, if your entire field of study is organized around studying the Indian subcontinent or the Arabic world, I mean, the entire Arabic world. But the university says, but we're not going to allow you to teach Arabic. We're certainly not going to allow, help you to understand it. The field is, the um, you don't have a curriculum. You don't have a meaningful major. You could offer an undergraduate major called Islamic Studies and Translation, but you would never grapple with the primary materials produced by the culture itself. Um, and these two steps in combination, we might merge your department. We might cease the continuity of study in your field and instead place you in an amalgam called everywhere but the US, I guess. And we might dismantle your curriculum. Felt like, and frankly, although the dean denied it in the email to you, I think actually does amount to an existential threat um, to to these fields of study.
I actually agree, which is why I had you on for the interview.
Yeah.
But but before we kind of move on to, I have so many questions about this. But first, I just want to know, like, is this like what tenure is for? Because I feel like sending an email to a list host that says the administration has gone full MAGA and brings to light that god awful Chat GPT question. Like, I was a Latin teacher for 10 years. I don't know on what planet you think Chat GPT can teach a language.
Right. Yeah.
I was actually shocked that the teacher of teachers would suggest such a thing. But what does this mean for you professionally and politically inside of the university to be speaking up? So you wrote the email, but you've also published several articles over the years. Kind of, you're like Cassandra, like sounding the alarm, and but everybody's still going into the bathhouse. So
right. That's not a Cassandra was the prophet who was in essence given the curse of being correct but never believed. It has criticizing my own university and criticizing the leadership of my division, and publishing a lot of financial information about the university, even publicly available financial information about the university, has put me in an interesting position vis-a-vis my employer. There is actually there's, interestingly, I'll just say, because lots of people who've been at universities know, have heard the phrase academic freedom, and they've heard the phrase tenure and so on. I'll simply say that there's a strictly speaking, academic freedom is the freedom to say things within your field of competence, within your discipline, either in research, writing, or teaching. And it's kind of a well-recognized legal matter that academic freedom does not apply to statements you might make on things other than your subject area. In the classroom, if I were to stop talking about the Roman Empire and start opining about, I don't know, the Affordable Care Act or the war in Gaza, that is actually not covered by academic freedom, and probably shouldn't be for all sorts of good reasons. I mean, I think if we want academic freedom to be preserved and honored, we need to be narrow and careful about what it protects. And the same is true of tenure. So there's an interesting carve out in academic freedom. There's a kind of small series of court cases that raise the question: does academic freedom extend to the discussion of university policy? So obviously, discussing the budget of the university or discussing its policy about language study is not my field of research expertise, which is the Roman Empire. I'll stop there, but yes, you're absolutely correct. It has placed me in a very interesting position, and tensions arise. Yeah, but I'll stop there.
I applaud you for it, though. So this The other thing that's kind of interesting about this, though, is that, I want to talk in general about attitudes towards humanities, but classics in particular, I feel like occupies a weird cultural position right
Mm.
now, in the sense that I just saw a headline that Trump is demanding classical architecture for federal buildings. We're in a situation where you can go find some like stoic online who's going to tell you all about the Roman world and how it makes you a real man. We just had men think every day about the Roman Empire as like a
Mm.
little zeitgeist that made Saturday Night Live. So it feels like the Roman Empire is still kind of like in our hearts and minds. It's just like relevant in so many ways. But then the actual study of it is getting short shrift. How, like, from somebody who's inside the house, like, how does that feel to you? And like, why do you see that happening? Like, you'd think the classics would sell. Why wouldn't you
Yeah.
just max that out at the university level?
So actually, I think classics does sell. Um, uh, Classics is in an extraordinarily enviable position. We probably shouldn't take it for granted, but for much of my lifetime, it's certainly been true that an amazing percentage of American undergraduates um, uh, come to the university and take a class in classics before they're done. They take a class, they look around. My wonderful scholar and colleague, now retired Alain Bresson, used to offer a class on the ancient economy or the origins of money. That class filled up like that. Classes on, if you were to offer a class called Pagans and Christians, it would fill up like that. I offer a class on, in a periodic basis on Roman law. It fills up every time. Now, we have a smaller number of students at the University of Chicago, often just fantastic students who study a whole bunch of Greek and Latin and become classics majors. And just by way about something like coming back to language, right? We in many other places have different versions, quote unquote, of the major, in which you could major in classics by doing what we call the language intensive variant.
That's what I did. It was great.
Yeah, we throw in the word intensive precisely to attract people to the university in Chicago. Like we call it, we could call it the scary major, and then you would attract even more people. Yeah, and we have a I don't remember the exact title, but let us say we have a language less intensive variant. And the quick answer is the language intent in every department I know something about. The language intensive variant is almost always more popular because the people who want to study a foreign culture want to study the actual production of that. They don't want it mediated by a translator, and which is not to say that people don't read translations. Of course, you should read translation, and people should make translations. It's a beautiful thing to wrestle with a language at that level. But so a small number of people do the major. Now, should we worry about something like a gap between the very large numbers of people who take one class or two classes? I mean, those classes that they take in Greece and Rome might be the study abroad. And frankly, if you're going to do study abroad, why not do study abroad in Athens or Rome? I mean, for God's sake, what a wonderful place to spend time, right? There's a gap between the large numbers who take one or two classes and the small number of majors. And every now and then, a university administrator or a lay person will say something like, aren't you worried about the small number of majors? And the answer is, I'm not worried in the slightest. I mean, to come back to mathematics, and I mentioned mathematics because I think the shape of its enrollment looks a little bit like ours. And I also, my brother was a mathematician, and so we would chat about something like policy about this in a kind of nerdy family way. But an astonishing number of people take some lower level mathematics at university. You need it for engineering, or you need it for chemistry. You need it for pre-med, right?
Oh yeah, everybody used to cry about that calculus track. So, good secret. I used my AP stat credit to get out of taking math at UChicago, and it was the best because everybody died in those classes.
Oh no, I took took a linear algebra class. I don't even know why. When I got to university, simply because I suppose because I thought, you know, it was part of my high school curriculum, and I thought it was just part of being an educated person. And the next class in line beyond whatever it was I arrived there, and the next class was something linear algebra. It was not a talent of mine. It probably wasn't even a talent before that, but I had a very, very funny conversation with the very, very great mathematician who taught me this class. And he called me in to talk about my final exam, in which I had somewhat oddly gotten all the proofs right and screwed up all the problems, essentially because I'd asked my brother and his roommates to tutor me the night before. So I had this like knowledge poured into my head that lasted about 12 hours. And he basically offered to give me a kind of, semi-respectable grade, like a B, if I would promise him I would never take another math class.
A gentleman's B.
It was an easy bargain to strike. But, there are many, many fields at the university where people take one or two classes because they love the subject, because they're curious, and they have no intent to make. There are other things that they love, they want to major in. And why that's it may not be obvious, but there are many ways in which American higher education is different in its structures than what happens in other parts of the world. And there are parts of the world where, in essence, you sign up for a major before you arrive at the university, and a great deal of your coursework at the university, the overwhelming and possibly all of your coursework at the university, is directed toward a specialized field of study. That is, you specialize much earlier. And the structure of American college and university education is different because we allow people to postpone that commitment till much later,
Yes.
in part for all sorts of good reasons. I mean, if your imagination about what you might do, what you might study, and for that matter, if your imagination about what you might do was fixed at 18 and possibilities started to be foreclosed, well, think back to your high school. How many different subjects were taught at your high school? I mean, and you can see that in the United States. There are universities where you at least indicate a major before you arrive. I mean, you can change it after you get there. But the range of things that people select as a possible major coming out of high school, simply because of what they know about what you could possibly study, is just so much more limited than what you could actually do at a university. So, but to focus on number of majors as opposed to number of enrollments is to say that is in essence to discount something like the delightful and honorable curiosity of people who wander into at least one classics class, and they're going to take one class on the Assyrian Empire, and they're going to take one class on the electrification of India, and they're going to take I took two classes in evolutionary biology at Princeton just because my roommate said, "This is really cool. You should come to this class." And I did. And it was really cool. The fact that I did not major in biology is neither a loss to me nor a loss to the biology department at Princeton. It's just the affordance. It's just one of the most astonishing affordances of being at a university, is having that expertise made available to you.
I think the difference here, I really love that you're bringing up math and science, because I think one of the things that's the hardest, I guess, sell for the humanities right now is that people are very utilitarian in terms of what college and education are for. It's very much like, okay, well, how is this going to help me get a job? What field am I training for? Even when I was majoring classics, it's like, you're going to major in that? Why? What are you going to get out of that? Or like, I had to answer so many parent questions about why should my child take Latin and not Spanish? And so I guess from your end of the education business, like, what is your current answer to that question? I think we all have one.
Well, I suppose I have two very quick ones. One is simply historical, which is to caution people that there's an ebb and flow to student interest. I think the more important answer I'll give second, but the first one occurs to me simply because I'm at the University of Chicago, and I once had for my work to read a report made at the University of Chicago 40 something years ago. I think it came out in either 81 or 82, about, in essence, you might say doctoral education, but more broadly, it raised the question of at the policy level of what to do when certain fields weren't popular or not popular. And this is to paraphrase and summarize a very long and fascinating document. But one possible reading of this document was it said, interest in various STEM fields. You might just say interest in STEM, although the acronym wasn't used then. Interest in STEM fields is now so low that the question could legitimately ask, should we continue to offer, doctoral education or higher level education in STEM at all? And 40 years on, this notion looks ridiculous. But they were just having an extraordinary problem getting students to study these fields, and in particular, study them in an advanced way. But we didn't abandon it then. The more important issue is the one that you raised quite specifically, which is that students are being told, and universities internally are judging themselves based on odd criteria like the job placement afterwards, income afterwards, and so on. So there I'll make two specific responses, and then we can elaborate on. First, that's simply not what education is for. Higher level education is not about producing a skill set that's isomorphic with a specific job. That's ridiculous. My other thing is what happens if you change jobs. Preparing you for the first job you'll have in life might not be preparing you for life itself. And second, as with the historical example I gave about STEM in the early 1980s, there's a whole series of reports coming out now from newspapers. There's a recent report from the Federal Reserve Bank and so on about employment of recent college graduates. And for better or for worse, AI has come first for low-level coding and low-level for jobs that involve quantification. So the percentage of undergraduate majors who are unemployed is something like highest in undergraduate finance and undergraduate computer science. You have double the chance of being unemployed if you're a computer science major than if you're an art history major.
Oh my God.
And I presume that these people were told, and they were actually probably correctly told. I mean, I don't think people were lying to them. 2 or 3 years ago, when the 2025 graduates entered college in 2021, they were probably correctly told that a computer science undergraduate degree was a ticket to a stable job and a great income. And 4 years later, it's not clear that that is true. Or it's certainly not true in the way it was 4 years ago, because coding in particular is something that these machines appear now to be able to do pretty well for themselves. So it takes a certain kind of very dangerous hubris, even if you believe that a university education should train you for a specific job. It takes a particular kind of hubris to tell the young people which of those majors is best. We simply don't know. I mean, I say as an historian that history is not destiny, and I would not put myself in the business of telling somebody what to major in because it will make him money.
Yeah. I actually kind of want to come back to history is not destiny, but first, the other thing I've been noting, and I want to kind of confirm that this is the case, is that, one thing that you mentioned, when we think about money, we're also thinking about money for the university and like which majors are profitable to run. And I mean, are the humanities, I've also seen, I don't really understand why they're treated as like the waste in terms of expenditures, because first of all, I mean, science PhDs cost more. Even in grad school, like the science PhDs were making a good $6,000 a year more than we religious studies PhDs were. It was rude. But also, sciences are supposed to be bringing in grants, which are now getting killed off in mass numbers. So our government also no longer values STEM very, very clearly, at least for the moment. And those are the subjects that require labs and equipment and animals and people to care for the animals and like everything.
No. Let me say something about science, and I'll come back to the humanities.
Yeah,
What is happening in the sciences is, uh, first, an extraordinary tragedy for the country,
I agree.
and second, it's going to be devastating for universities. Let me just if you look at there's absolutely no reason why anyone should look at this, except for hardcore nerds, and perhaps surprising that, say, somebody like myself in the humanities would know. But if you look at the NSF, the National Science Foundation, which is a branch of the government, right? If you look at the National Science Foundation's kind of ask, its request for funding for next year, right? It's now being directed by appointees of the Donald Trump administration. And so they have requested that their own budget be cut. This is not a normal sort of thing, but they've requested, and as part of this, they itemize areas where they itemize the areas of science that they propose to fund, and their figures for the previous year and the figures for the present year. But one of the things that they actually calculate for you or predict is the number of people in the past who were supported by the National Science Foundation and the number of people who will be supported if you give them the money they're asking for. And this is broken down in a variety of ways, like actual scientists with jobs. How many of them will be paid to spend some hours on this research project? Postdocs, in the very first stage of a career, how many of them will be funded? Doctoral students, how many of them will have their graduate education paid for? And then, because some of these NSF projects involve, in essence, support education, there are how many high school teachers will have continuing education paid for by this, and how many high school and elementary school students will be exposed to science by virtue of NSF funding. And the request of the NSF for next year, for the next year's funding, includes cuts of about 70%. I haven't looked at these numbers in a couple of days, so but that's the order of magnitude we're talking about, in every one of these categories. So even though the kind of national talk, whoever's doing that talking, is about science, 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 careers, 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 industry, 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 what we are actually proposing to do is diminish the exposure of elementary and high school students to science. And in cutting the available spaces for doctoral education, we are in essence going to produce in the near future 70% less teachers, 70% less workers for the pharmaceutical industry, 70% less workers for industry in general. It's extraordinary. So it's complete madness as a national policy, and that's if you believe
Yes.
the whole the job of the university is produce drones. Even if the job is to produce drones, we are destroying ourselves. Let me just say a word about humanities funding. The quick answer is you're absolutely right when you talk about labs. Let's take the whole category of research and set it aside, and the expenses of doing modern scientific research, which something like grow hugely each generation. Like the frontiers of knowledge in the sciences are just dramatically more expensive now than they were a generation ago, and that presumably will happen again. It's just lies in the nature of scientific discovery. But even the delivery of instruction in these laboratory sciences is dramatically greater. So by far the cheapest units the cheapest departments, the cheapest fields of study are the humanities and the humanistic social sciences, the non-quantitative sciences, where you don't need large-scale computing power and you don't need large-scale labs. So in very strong contrast to something like the common belief out there, actually, because of your background, because of the field you did your doctoral education, I will say that the units at the University of Chicago that come closest to simply paying for themselves through teaching are divinity, humanities, and the text-based social sciences, so political theory, history. Those are the units of the university that are the least expensive for the university to run. They're not the most expensive. They're the least expensive for the university to run. Go Divinity.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Oh, then why are we cutting them? Oh, it hurts so bad. So you talk about history is not destiny.
Yeah.
But you do interesting work. I don't know how much you see of your work in the world today, but you do a lot of writing about empire,
Yeah.
provincial understandings of empire, religion,
Yeah.
law. Do you have any ancient lessons for us now? Like, I mean, I find myself kind of turning to history more for comfort.
Well, two quick thoughts, and I'd be happy to pursue this more. Or maybe three. The first is, I remember talking to people a lot, and I ran around giving a bunch of talks at kind of conferences about quote unquote American empire in the early stages of the American invasion of Iraq, and that led to lesson one, which is a concern that historical kind of imperial powers or great regional powers or macro powers, whatever you want to call them, because it was an open question whether America really was a quote unquote empire in the traditional sense. But let's just call them quote unquote great powers, because that term gets bandied around a lot in foreign relations and so on. Great powers are often at their most violent and seek the most demonstrable forms of dominance precisely when there's an internal perception, however unarticulated, that they're in fact becoming weak. To use terms you might use of a toddler, they lash out.
Yeah.
So this moment of asserting American dominance in 2003-4, and the present moment of asserting American dominance may not be a simple sign of strength, and it may not be a reclaiming of strength. It may be that we are performing some last gasp, and we should beware of bringing that about. Second, a concern of mine both in religion and law, and you might say broadly in government, and it interests a lot of people in the ancient world, in the Ottoman Empire, the Roman Empire, is how did these giant states, to use lack of it, these giant political communities, how did these giant communities manage to remain so stable for so long? Right? They might strike us as wildly internally different. The Roman Empire stretched from something like the southern border of Egypt to the border of Scotland, for God's sake. If you look at China, or you look at what we might call the Iranian Empire, and you stick, your viewers probably can't see it, but I'm going to stick my hands on top of one another over and over again, and you stick a map of the Chinese Empire on top of a map of quote unquote the Chinese Empire on top of a map of the Chinese Empire, and they occupy something like the same space. There's something ecological, cultural, and so forth about its territorial expression that is historically continuous. And the Persian Empire, right, was located in, its geographic center was, Fars, right? And it spread out from there. But there's a core which is continuous. Nobody has ever tried to have a Roman Empire again. What a ridiculous thing to do. Even Britain, which compared itself, even the British Empire, which compared itself to Rome, did not attempt to rule the same geographic area. It was a ridiculously artificial area with literally hundreds of languages. And why didn't it fall apart from within? Why didn't the Ottoman Empire, with all these crazy religions and languages, why didn't it fall apart from within? Why didn't internal diversity cause it to collapse? I mean, we're anxious. I mean, the present U.S. government is anxious about the presence of, basically a few Spanish speakers. I mean, I don't know how to put it.
Yeah, I mean,
they have essentially one immigrant group. Right? They're hostile to many, but our deportation efforts are directed above all at a single, something like, loosely speaking, cultural group. And we're like, oh my God, we must eject them. I mean, there's a kind of insanity to it. There's various forms of self-harm and insanity we're performing at the moment. But America is, for all its interest, America is so much less diverse. And there's something really extraordinarily tragic about, I mean, to come back to the language of anxiety about, the government lashing out. We're lashing out externally and trying to assert dominance, and we're lashing out internally. And that's not what longstanding states do. It's a tragedy, because it's, even a trivial study of history will reveal it's entirely unnecessary.
Yeah.
Large scale, huge political communities have managed to persist through time with internal diversity by basically practicing different kinds of tolerance. And this isn't the path we're on now is not going to end well.
Yeah. No, I mean, it makes sense. The first thing you learn about the Roman Empire when you're doing Roman Empire class, right, is that, like, oh, they had a tendency to let people continue worshiping their own gods and speaking their own languages, and they just put admins in there and collected taxes, and we're great. I mean, it's not perfect.
Yeah, it's not perfect, right? Yeah. No, I mean, you shouldn't end on a note in which we just like praise some ancient empire. I mean, perfectly clear, like, the Romans would tend to go around to a space. They would let's say the Romans ruled the United States. They would take some unit of population, let us say the city of Chicago, because they tended to think in terms of cities. And they would say to the government of the city of Chicago, we have conquered you, be as you were. We'll be back, next August 29th to collect taxes. Bye. And they would then empower the government of Chicago to rule itself. But ancient cities were like modern cities in that they were internally diverse. And one of the problems that erupted, is, you will know because of your own educational expertise, is that, these cities of the Eastern Mediterranean frequently contained minority populations of, Punic speakers, Jews, all sorts of immigrant communities, Phoenicians and so on, right? I just mentioned them. All these immigrant communities that, practiced minority religions within the city-state. And some of the forms of conflict we see, and in fact, I happen to suspect that it's true that many of the earliest so-called Christian persecutions were not persecutions by the Roman government. They were expressions of friction in highly localized places. There's very little evidence that say the violence that that we call, let us say, that produced the stories of the martyrs of Lyon. There's very little sense that was happening 50 or 100 miles away. It wasn't a Roman persecution in that sense. It was an expression of internal friction between something like an immigrant group, often one that spoke its own language, and the majority population in a specific place. And the Roman system of just saying each community may have its own gods didn't solve the problem of small minority populations within a city-state. And that it's an issue we know best from the study of Jews and Christians, but I'm sure it applied to others. So no, ancient systems of tolerance had their limits.
Yes. We could go on about it forever, but because time is limited, one thing I do want to ask, and it's on my mind, I think, as someone who really values what I received at UChicago and then later at Yale, if things really go to hell, if all these programs start to contract, if we lose our heritage, right? How do we preserve it? What's the future in a fractured world?
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's an exceptionally difficult question. One answer, but it would require some combination of planning and idealism, right? Is that it may be that there will be, broadly speaking, a retreat across American higher education and its elite research universities, where you know the gossip, and I mean something much more serious than gossip, but essentially news reports coming out of the University of Oregon suggest that the University of Oregon may be the next place that announces a closure of a whole bunch of especially humanities departments, and in fact the laying off a bunch of faculty, because just merging or closing a department doesn't save money unless you lay off people, right? So there may be a retreat in some universities from the fields of study which they practice, and if across the ecology of American higher education you can preserve a small number of departments that do doctoral study, you could retain in some meaningful but small way the continuity of training that would be necessary for the field to exist. As I say, one of my concerns is if you stop training people, it'd be extraordinarily hard. You mentioned Hittite earlier.
Yeah.
You could say the same thing about minor branches of philosophy or linguistics, that if you had no continuity of training, if you just closed it down, and 30 years later you decided, gosh, I wish we knew something about philosophy of mind, and you looked around and said, do we have anyone who does philosophy of mind? It might not be possible. You don't know, but it might not be possible to assign somebody, oh, go revive that discipline. I think we have some books, in basement level B of Regenstein Library. Might not be possible. We might have given up something without knowing that's what we were doing. So it might be possible, but some of these fields of study are very small. The Sanskrit program at the University of Chicago is enormously distinguished. A real sadness in what is happening here is that the dean has claimed that one of the criteria she employed when deciding whether to allow a program to have doctoral admissions was placement. Were they the sort of department whose graduates got hired into academic jobs elsewhere? Well, I don't think she can, in fact, have taken the numbers seriously, because our Sanskrit program, that is, even within South Asian studies, our Sanskrit program in particular, really, it has an extraordinary placement. It might be 90 or 100% of all of its students find out, which is unheard of.
Unheard of.
I appreciate the wow, because there are fields of study where, as an academic matter, even single institutions bear an enormous responsibility for continuity and training. And to come back to the issue of jobs, universities are not vocational schools, right? We know what vocational education looks like. There are lots of employers out there, from finance firms. My son is a computer scientist. There are manufacturing jobs where no matter what you do in college or whatever, you do more training when you arrive on the job. And people who move jobs at age 30 or 35 or 40 often do new jobs. We know what job training looks like. Among other things, you can pay somebody to educate you for a certain task. But universities, right? And those are often for-profit employers will train you for their for-profit job. Universities are charitable organizations, as a matter of the IRS, code. We are 501c3 charitable organizations because we are not motivated by profit, right? That is not our job. Our job is to sustain certain kind of ideals in education and research that once upon a time the United States deemed valuable in and of themselves, right? And we are supposed to gather, question, critique, and produce knowledge in all areas of the world that touch upon human existence. And it would be an abdication of responsibility of the highest order for us to say there are just things we no longer care about, that we are going to abandon possibly forever. That is not our job. And we should we should not claim to be universities, and we should certainly not be claiming to fulfill our original charter as educational enterprises if we cut down on the subjects that we make available to our students.
Yeah, I think it's true. So for people who are not kind of part of, university culture at this time, but who care, what is one thing that a normal person could do who cares about this situation and wants to help?
I think in the current moment of something like, broadly speaking, political hostility by specific voices of authority within the culture, many of whom are in government, toward higher education, I think people should choose not simply a subject, but a home for that subject, like in the world. It could be a music venue. It could be a concert venue. It could be a museum. It could be a local historical society. Frankly, it could be the ABA. It could be the American Birding Association. They should choose some civic institution that loves its subject for its own sake and commit to it. You should renew a commitment to the institutions in our society that sustain curiosity. And all of that will have effects that are good, mutually good for all other institutions. You don't have to do something for a university. If you did something for your local museum, you would be furthering the project.
I like it. Actionable, meaningful. So I've been grilling you for almost an hour, so you actually get softy questions now. So the first is, I normally ask people to recommend a game, but I don't know if you're a gamer, you might be a reader. So what's a piece of media that you recommend that has brought you joy recently?
Oh, piece of media. Well, I have a 5-year-old. I also have a 27-year-old, and I have my wife has kids who are 11 and 14. So but I spent a lot of time. I spent a lot of time reading to my 5-year-old. So my exposure to quote unquote media at the moment, other than work related media, is probably stuff I do with my 5-year-old. But reading to him is a joy. Rediscovering books that I'd read before was a joy. And one of the astonishing things about having kids who are so far apart in age is I'm being exposed to new young person's literature that did not exist when I was a kid, and frankly did not exist. Sometimes did not exist when my older son was small. And I'd have to say there's some really extraordinary children's literature out there. Great stuff. Yeah. It's not quite the answer you were looking for.
No, actually, give a title.
It's just
Drop a title or two. What's your favorite?
Well, one thing that really amazed me when my older son was young was a book that came out while he was a young person, called The Astonishing Life of Octavian Nothing, which was perhaps the greatest piece of young adult fiction I'd read in decades. It's an astonishing story about something like race and Enlightenment science in the age of the American Revolution. It would be impossible to describe the richness and wonders of this book.
Wow, okay.
And then a recent book I read with my younger son was by Kate DiCamillo, a very famous person. She doesn't need me to sell her work. But this, I think, was just a particularly magical book called The Puppets of Spellhorst. And the economy with which incredibly distinctive and amusing and fascinating personalities, not just funny. I mean, it's like Milne in that guy. It's like the actual first books of Poe, in that kind of really rich and fascinating characters are given to people on the basis of extraordinary economy of expression, quite apart from the wonders of the story itself. It's a great, great book. The Puppets of Spellhorse is an astonishing work of fiction.
Excellent. And then a lot of people have already found you online, but if people want to find your work online, where do you like to be found?
You mean specific things?
Yeah, like, I mean, are you on social media? Do you welcome
no,
contact
not really,
by
but,
email? I don't know if you welcome it, but you got it recently.
People. I do try to answer absolutely all email. I'm not on social media, although I've been thinking about putting all the newspaper articles about contemporary universities on a Substack. I might do that. I gave a lecture once and the lecture is available online about at a Center for Ethics in Toronto about something like the nature of peace in the Roman Empire. And I remember thinking that I actually got some formulations in that thing right. And I've given a couple of lectures that are online on the fall of the Roman Empire. I think I gave one in Vancouver where, because it's an improvisational exercise giving a lecture, or at least some aspects of it are improvisational. And you do always worry. I mean, I'm sure musician friends of mine likewise worry that you don't always get it perfect each time. So I'd have to think, but if anybody writes, I will write back.
Fantastic.
That may be the one promise I could actually make. I will write back if anyone writes.
Cliff, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show.
Oh, thank you, Liz. This was great. This was fantastic.
And for those of you out there wondering what does this have to do with games, I would tell you that it takes a lot of curiosity and engagement to be a good game designer too. How do you be interested in making something fun if you're never interested in anything fun? So
yeah. And then making a certain kind of game is like writing a piece of fiction. You have to imagine. You have to have an extraordinarily capacious imagination to put together, as it were, a world. Yeah. No. It's a thing. Yeah.
All right, everybody out there, thank you so much for listening. Please like, subscribe, comment, ask questions, and most of all, happy gaming.